So what are we looking for? Well, obviously, if you see one running around, then you've got them. If you find a dead one, you've got them. But that's a bit hit and miss. You've just got to be in the right place at the right time. So the things that we should be looking for on a much more frequent basis are footprints and burrows and droppings and gnawing and smear marks. But again, I'm trying to underline if you do this as part of your day, every day we could be looking for footprints and burrows and droppings, because you're on site. So it just makes life much easier. And of course, as soon as you see something, then something needs to be done about it. And that's kind of the message that we're looking to push to farming is don't just ignore it until all of a sudden you see them running around, because by then you've got potentially dozens, if not hundreds of them. The sooner we can do something about it, the easier it is to get rid of them. We have monitoring equipment. Now this is black ultraviolet light. And there is something called tracking dust. It's all a bit CSI, but what it allows us to do, and you can see in the image that's just come up, in this situation, we had a mouse box. There was actually traps inside this one, and the mice were simply walking over the top of the box and not going into it at all. Now, from that side, it makes control impossible, because if they're not going to go in the box that you've put things in, you're not going to catch them. But the trouble is, and this is, again, where we find a lot of pest control is going, because everything is in the box, and auditors are pushing us down this as well. Because everything's in the box, we kind of make that our default. Have we got a problem? Yes, no. So you open the box, there's no bait take, there's nothing in the traps. Therefore, you assume you have no activity. Close the lid, leave it for another period of time. Where tracking dust comes into play, of course, is it then allows us to see what's going on over the top of the box, where I would come from a pest control point, actually in between the box. That's the most important area. But sand does exactly the same. It doesn't have to be very clever and technical. This is rats more than mice, but mice would do exactly the same. And you can just see the footprints that we have here. Now, it's not very clever. It's not revolutionary. But what it's allowing us to do is put something on the ground outside of a bait box that we can then check every time we walk past. This is also very easy because you just literally pat it back down again. You then have a nice smooth surface. And so if anything walks over it tonight, you can then see that tomorrow. So it's an ongoing monitoring system that really, if you're not using it already, would be something I'd recommend in certain locations. And that may well be at the entrance to bait boxes, because you might have footprints that literally walk straight past the bait box entrance and keep on going. You'd never get that kind of information if you didn't have a sand or a monitoring system in place. It might well be, if you go back to the tracking dust, that you put tracking dust on the inside of the bait box. Actually see if they're going into the box or not, because that's all part of there's no point in doing more of the same if it's not working. Technology is increasing. Even the world of killing mice now has CCTV. And in these situations, we use motion activated cameras, so we get a really clear picture of what's going on. This was in a pig farm, so we've got the hopper and a feeding tube. There is no way that we would have got that image if we had walked around the farm, because all the mice, of course, would have shot off and gone into the cover. So it tells us a lot of what's going on, particularly in terms of population numbers. What we also found on this farm, and you can see here where there's a bait station, the general opinion was that there were no mice. And there was no mice because they weren't going into the bait box. So technology does help, as bizarre as when we talk about this with mice internally, because it gives you a very clear picture of what's going on. Equally externally, you know, we have all of our bait stations in and around properties, but actually what job are they doing? Do we know what's walking around and potentially what could be walking into them? The only place that I would have a bait box here is on this farm is there, because you know exactly that's where the rats are active. They're creatures of habit, therefore they'll always go back to the same place. Where technology also helps, and I use this for all the wrong reasons, but that's a mouse sitting on a rat trap. You've got to know what it is that you've got before you can put the right options down. Even worse than that, it's a mouse sitting on the activation plate that should have released the swinging arm, so it's not even doing the job that it should be doing. Again, you would only get that with the use of technology. I hope it illustrates the ability to monitor ongoing without the need to necessarily do anything about it. But droppings then comes in. It's a really important part of understanding where mice are active. Mice will go to the loo wherever they need to go to the loo. So from a number 2, from our droppings point of view, what that means is that it leaves continual evidence when they're walking around. Now, the thing I would recommend to every farmer is clean them up. And I'm not talking about getting a vacuum out, but if you got a brush and just swept them into a pile and leave it for 24 hours, what you will then be seeing is either no droppings, i.e. you've got no activity, or you'll have more droppings, black droppings, which means you have activity. If you put bait down, what you would then expect to see is colored droppings. Clearing up allows you to monitor ongoing much, much more effectively as well. I know it's not necessarily your job to clean up mouse poo. However, it really does help from a monitoring side. In terms of access, if you can restrict them moving around a location, it really helps. So mice need a gap of at least 6 millimeters. And as you can see here from a laboratory test that they did, they left a very small gap under a traditional sort of Tom and Jerry style mouse hole. And then the mouse can compress its body and then start to squeeze through, and then it pops out the other side. So if you imagine taking a baro and poking it into any of the holes that you've got in and around buildings, that's what the mice can access. Now, from a mouse point of view, around the outside isn't an issue, it's inside. What can you do to minimize that kind of ingress? Now, obviously, under the base of doors really helps. As you can see here, we've got 2 gaps, and this is just where the threshold was broken away. So these are very difficult to proof. It just might be that you've got to take that out and reconcrete it so that you get a proper seal. Now, from a mice point of view, particularly where you have sheds next door to each other, the mice will run from shed to shed. Particularly if you have empty sheds, they'll move to occupied sheds because obviously that's where there's going to be feed. But also when we've then got pop holes, and within pigs, we find these a lot in creeper lids as well. That gap is big enough for the rodents to come through. So when I say take a baro and see where you can put it, sometimes actually it's just the obvious things that you can do. And that is the closing the pop holes. It is making sure that there are no gaps under doors. It's also, and I call them pinch points, it's not allowing the rodents to get from one location to another. Try and contain them within one space, and they're much, much easier to control. Now, when we bring rats into play, rats will just make any size hole that they need. They need a minimum of 10 millimeters, and that's not because they can squeeze their body through, but what they can do, it can get their teeth, and it gives them purchase, and that's where, as you can see on the image, they simply just gnaw the size hole that they're looking for. But what you've got here is 1, very clear evidence that you have activity, and 2, you have what I call these pinch points. So you've now got the ability to either put a trap there, or to put some bait there, or to put some tracking dust there, and see if that activity continues. Now, who in reality would put a plastic air brick one brick up from the ground? But these are the kind of things where we have to manage that to keep rodents outside. You may have noticed these dirty smudge marks around the property. We call them smear marks. And they're very important for us because it shows us that these areas are being used. And you can see you've actually got some mouse droppings up on top here. And I'd suspect in this environment, what was happening is that the mice were, you can see there's the smudge marks all across the top. So they were probably running, going through the grain, running back up the legs, up across the top, around here. Now, this is a really important point as a pinch point because it's a physical barrier that the mice have to do something around. And again, very important for you guys who are looking to do that element of control, because otherwise it's a bit hit and miss where you're going to put your control options. Now, I appreciate you may not have silos of grain all around, certainly open grain like this. But if you take this example and try and put it into areas where you do have mice active, can you use rodenticide? Because if you can't use rodenticide, actually the only option that you may have is traps. Now, traps are very effective. Not only can you see what you've got, you can throw the carcass in the bin. As soon as we start talking about rodenticide control, they become contaminated waste or hazardous waste. The other advantage that you get with traps, it's really easy to put lots of them. They're not a significant cost. We'll look at traps in more detail a bit later. But the advantage of using lots of traps means that you have a greater opportunity of controlling mice. Now, that's obvious. But in reality, we don't put enough traps down. It's also an immediate control. Rodenticides will take 2 or 3 days to work. And actually, if you're using the multi-feeds, it could potentially take 7 to 10 days to work. So you've still got this activity going around and gnawing cables and bits and pieces. So traps are incredibly beneficial. I would love to see the look in your eyes, because there's usually a few wry smiles that come off the back of, you've got to clean up. And you are the best placed people to know what needs to be done on site. Clearing up helps kill the infestation, primarily because you take away their nesting material. You take away the areas that they hide natural predators, so your birds of prey coming in, and it also gives them warmth. So when we start to talk about temperature variations, actually there's a lot of things that these kind of environments give them. When we talk about food, we have a storage or a feed silo here. There's a load of spillage that's on the ground, and lo and behold, there's a load of rat footprints that is then going up and feeding from this spillage. Now, guess which one had rats and guess which one didn't have rats? You know, these are the kind of questions. It's almost the image on the right is the what good looks like. If you have a spillage, and they can occur even with sealed systems, you've got to clean it up. Now, birds coming in, and obviously salmonella is a possibility there. However, the key drive, of course, is rodents and making sure that they don't have an alternate food source, because that is much more attractive than the baits potentially. So clean up wherever you can, minimize food opportunities wherever you can. But the reality is there will be food around. It's just low-hanging fruit is probably the best example that we can say there. So from a principle of pest management proofing. Now, I appreciate that we don't have sheds up on mushroom domed caps anymore, but the principle of what used to happen actually was really beneficial from a pest control point of view. And again, I use this as the mindset as to what we should be looking to achieve. Now, one of the great advantages that they had by having a gap underneath was that it meant that there was an opportunity for predatory animals to come in. Rats do not like open spaces. What we're finding with a lot of sheds, shipping containers is probably the best example, where because they're so low to the ground, the only thing that can go in underneath there is rats and mice. I'm not saying that you lift all of your sheds up off the ground, but the principle being is if the rats can't go underneath there, there's nowhere for them to nest. And that's got to be a drive. And where they used to look at in the olden days was actually if it's much harder for them to nest, then they probably won't. So that principle of not being able to get into a building was also the example that we've got here with these mushroom dome caps. Rats can't go vertical because they can't hold their body weight. So again, look at your buildings, try and work out how the mice and the rats are getting in and active in the first place. And that's what we then need to go back and start to proof. I'm sure you've all been told that wire wool is a very good proofing material. They don't like the wire in their gums, and particularly if you can wedge it in with a screwdriver so it becomes quite compact and tight, they then can't pull it back out again. The wire wool is very beneficial. And this is a very common example of what we tend to find is where, even worse than this, is where the waste pipe has been taken out and then there's a hole that's been left behind. But normally we tend to find, a 2-inch hole for a 1-inch pipe, and it gives a bit of play. That's the areas that need to be sealed back up again, because it's very easy for the rodents to literally nip up the wall and then they're inside the property. Now, again, these are general examples, but hopefully they paint a picture as to the things that we need to be looking for and we need to be proofing. Because again, we come back to our base of doors. These gaps are incredibly beneficial. Now, we've then got a load of feathers here that then becomes nesting material. So we've got a proofing issue and we've got a hygiene or a cleanliness issue. Now, from a proofing point of view, these are actually quite difficult to proof. Increasingly, we're now getting, and I talk about wire wool being very beneficial, but this is within a rubber strip. And the idea is the metal there is attached to the base of the door. You've then got a wire wool that they can't gnaw through. You've then got a rubber strip that makes that seal across the bottom. It might be that you just fit a metal kicker plate to the base of that door so that nothing can go through there. But it also needs cleaning up. So don't think that just proofing on its own will help solve your problem. It's usually a combination of 2 or 3 things. And hence we go back to our door that we had with the varying gaps. It might well be that we use mesh gauge. Now here it's an internal, this is actually in a kitchen, but the principle again is it stops activity from up here, which is one area. And what the mice were doing is they were actually using these copper pipes to gain vertical access up and down. It just provides that barrier. Again, go back and look at all of the buildings and just see where are the mice coming from and where are they going to, and how do we physically stop them doing that? Because that's a good part of pest management. And again, here we've got a good example of where the proofing has stopped rodents coming in externally. That is now impossible for rodents to get there. I think the only other thing that I would add on is probably a layer of stones around the base, just so that nothing could burrow down and go up behind the corrugated iron. But the principle here is that even in these hard to reach places, the proofing has been carried out. Internally, and again, you've got to look at your own properties or look at your own sheds and see what's what. This was done for insulation, so we had two sides of the wooden framework covered with a plyboard, and you can just see there's a bait station in there. Again, this is almost the backward approach to pest control. What we're not doing is looking to solve the issue of mice living in there. What we've done is we've applied a rodenticide to kill the mice that are living in there. So it's kind of take a couple of steps back, and then you can solve the problem, not just attend to the mice that have become active. And that's where we can see the mice were literally walking up the wall. They would come down, they would feed, obviously from all the spilt food that was on the floor, straight back up the wall, hide in those areas, no natural predators coming in. And of course, the mice were very happy. So back into our hierarchy. I hope that makes a bit more sense about this habitat management element that we were talking about in terms of non-chemical, non-lethal cleanup. Don't have activity in the first place. But the reality is we are going to have to use traps. Now, when we start talking about traps are really beneficial. A couple of slides ago, I mentioned it on that side. The first thing that we have to, of course, be very conscious on is our non-target species, and this is our drive from the environmental side. Now, we get lots of different ones. We get the say, heavy-duty ones, the plastic ones, the wooden-based ones. In reality, these are probably the best style traps that you can get. You obviously get larger ones for rats and smaller ones for mice. Now, the advantage that you have we affectionately call them snappies rather than breakback. They both do the same thing. So this one is set. The principle being is that when a mouse comes or a rat comes along and hits the plate, the bar comes down and a single blow to the back of the neck will kill it. So you've got one is set, that one is set, and that one is not set. And the yellow bar just is an easier methodology to see. Now, as I say, we get larger ones for rats, and there's just a sense of scale, smaller ones for mice. You also get lots of different types. Some have got metal bars, some have got teeth. Have a selection of all of them. They all do the same job, be it even a wooden one. It's the variety coming into play. There's metal ones that you can get nowadays as well. The advantage that you get with these, the food is actually underneath the activation plate. The other great side that you have with these is that they will all come, or most of them will come with holes at the end. Now, these are located here on the trap. What it allows you to do is bang them on the wall and position them vertically. We find a lot of where the mice are actually walking up the walls, simply put 2 or 3 traps on that route. Rats, we were finding if we put these about 3 or 4 inches up off the ground, bizarrely bacon fat was actually a very useful attraction to them. Every day there were dead rats where they would have to physically lean on the activation plate. So they'd have to put their paws here and lean up in order to gain access into the food that was there. Again, the advantage of traps, you can throw the carcass in the bin. There is no chemical residues, and also they're reusable. So whilst you've got them, clean them off. The key is resetting them. The key is making sure that you take away the dead ones so that the mice don't have this approach that is not a good thing. You can now also get them in plastic boxes as well. So if any areas where we need to be particularly sensitive that they may get knocked or they may get triggered or again, non-target species. And the idea being is that the rodent would walk in through this gap at the top. As it comes around the box, it's obviously then got to walk over the activation plate and it kills it that way. But the key with all traps is where you position them. As I say, some put them on the wall, certainly put them up high. This is what I would call my pinch point. So if we know that we've got mice, and again, it's just taken as an example, but if we know that we've got mice walking through this particular location here, and you put a trap down, sometimes you don't even have to bait them. And the mice will literally come along. They're inquisitive by what's there. They step on that plate and hey presto, all of a sudden the arm comes down and controls them. Now that's very beneficial because every day you will then know if you've got activity. Because if you don't have a mouse in there, they're not going to jump that. They're not going to turn around necessarily and walk off. If you don't have activity, it means that you're probably on the lines if you don't have mice either. So they can be very useful. They work just as well for rats, and wooden ones, as I say, work just as well. What I would say is that your external bait stations should have snap traps in. We'll talk about the use of bait and what we can have in our rat boxes outside, but we shouldn't be using bait consistently. Traps allows us to have that element of control. Here's a new trap that's come out. This one actually uses a CO2 piston drive So the idea is that the rodent is attracted by a lure at the top. As soon as its head goes through a sensor, the bolt comes through, and again, single blow to the back of the neck. Now, the advantage that this trap has is that it resets itself. It means that you don't have to do anything about it. And they say that this can kill up to sort of 20 times. You know, if you've talked about fen traps, you know all about these. The reminder to you, don't forget that they come under the Springtraps approval order. So therefore, they must be in natural or artificial tunnels, and they must be inspected frequently. And where I always go with this is that at least twice a day. Here, the irony, they weren't going into bait stations. So that's a plastic bait box. And this is where we find a lot of don't use plastic boxes if you don't need to. You know, they don't like, it's not a natural environment for them to walk into. And particularly when you've then got a bait box that they were walking around the side of, to then go behind a sloping cover that they're much more likely to go into because they can see the other end. It's less threatening to them. Hey presto, you then end up with a good control. Again, that's one of those, chuck it in the bin, reset it, put the slate back up again, and away you go. Increasingly, we get artificial tunnels, and the idea is that the rodents can then walk through. The trap is slightly set below the ground so that they will walk straight over the top. You can then cover them in material that they're much more likely to be walking on. Again, it's a big negative for plastic bait boxes when starting. The only advantage you have with a live capture trap, and this is the biggest consideration, is if you have things like water voles. So if you have any streams or ditches running through that potentially have water vole, the advantage with a live capture trap is that you can then release it if it's a non-target species. The problem, of course, is that you've then got to kill it if it's a target species. Quite a divisive subject. Just to remember, and again, a point of reminder, there is a code of practice now around the use of glue boards. You should be inspecting them as a minimum every 12 hours. There is debate at the moment in Scotland, particularly, that these are going to be banned. And they're done for humaneness because, unfortunately, people don't use them properly. Whereas if you put them down, you inspect them frequently, you get you get a couple of mice on there, you fold the board, you kill them, you throw it in the bin, you carry on. Actually, that's a very humane method of doing it, and probably the most humane method. Electronics is starting to come through more and more. Again, this is more for your awareness than necessarily anything else, where the electric circuit will then come through and stuns them very quickly. We're now starting to find Bluetooth technology is now going in the top of these boxes, and they are sending SMS messages. Now, again, I'm not saying that you run out and go and buy a load of these electronic traps. However, for sensitive areas, so if you've got electrical cupboards, if you've got data storage areas, you know, communication cables, and you cannot afford to have mice and rats walking around, that might be something just to start to think about. It actually saves an awful lot of time because the other side is you don't have to go and check any of your traps. You literally just wait for your phone to ping or an email to come through, and then you just deal with the ones that have gone off. And I hope that this has kind of shown where, a lot of people think pest control is about putting bait down. And what we're trying to do is raise the awareness on actually, if you can do the cleaning, the proofing, the hygiene, the education, is understanding how we do everything without the use of bait. I'm not trying to say that bait is bad and that we shouldn't be using it. What I want to do is raise and remind you that actually it's everything else associated with it is also part. It's what we call integrated pest management. And the more of that we can do, the less reliance there is on bait. But also auditors are jumping on the bandwagon of this non-chemical, non-lethal. You're not trying to kill them. What you're looking to do is prevent them in the first place. Again, that's a very strong area that the auditors like. And just to conclude, the auditors also like their reports. Again, I think that the more that we start driving down the CPD route, the more the auditors understand about rodent control, they will want to be seeing that you are being proactive, i.e. preventing them and trying to stop them, rather than reactive, which is waiting for the infestation to occur, and then you start throwing rodenticide at them, or you've got to use 100 traps. We've deliberately called it a monitoring and inspection log. It's not a treatment log. It's about trying to stop them in the first place.